The announcement of the midterm survival module had already put every cadet on edge. The training valley chosen for this segment of the program had a reputation: unpredictable fog banks, erratic winds, steep ridges that twisted like spirals, and narrow ravines where sound echoed in confusing ways. Even with advanced sensors, most trainees considered this place overwhelming. Without technology, the valley was practically a maze that swallowed sense and direction. But no one expected the instructors to remove that technological safety net entirely. Most cadets assumed the shutdown demonstration would last a few minutes, maybe as a symbolic gesture, just long enough to frighten the weaker trainees. Instead, everything died at once with a sharp metallic click that passed through each implant like a shock. The lights embedded in the cliffs winked out. The hovering drones monitoring temperature, movement, and vitals dropped into silent standby. Every personal device the cadets carried flashed once and went dark. Environmental monitors inside uniforms flatlined instantly. Scanners lost all signal. Even artificial compass support evaporated, leaving a dizzying emptiness where directional cues should have been. The sudden absence of digital feedback felt like losing a sense. Some cadets staggered as if the ground lurched beneath them. Others clutched at their necks or wrists, where their neural links used to pulse with constant reassurance. The valley, always unnervingly quiet, now felt suffocating. It became a pocket of wilderness untouched by anything modern, a place where instinct mattered more than training. The instructors stood on the upper ridge, their silhouettes barely visible through strands of early fog. Commander Hyrus raised a hand, amplifying his voice with no device at all, relying on sheer power of lungs. His voice rolled across the basin, harsh and unfiltered. He announced that the survival test had begun and that all cadets must operate without any technological assistance. The team must function as one unit. Navigation, communication, resource tracking, environmental analysis, all must be done manually. No exceptions. Panic rippled outward instantly. A cadet with a crystalline crest gasped as her internal vision went black. Another, whose species relied heavily on sensory implants, stumbled and nearly fell. A third began shouting that the test must be malfunctioning because no academy in the galactic network would ever deactivate medical monitors. Yet the instructors remained silent, observing reactions with unreadable expressions. Some cadets tried to restart their devices with frantic taps and slaps. A tall cadet with pale antennas shook his wrist module violently, convinced it would reignite out of pity. Another pressed her palms against the sides of her head, trying to force her neural compass to respond. Nothing helped. Every tool the group relied on had been stripped away. In the middle of this chaos stood Elias, the only human in the group, watching the valley with quiet curiosity instead of fear. He blinked once when his wrist screen died, shrugged lightly, and tucked the useless device into his pocket. To him, the silence created by the absence of constant digital chatter felt oddly nostalgic. He had grown up hiking through forests on Earth, where signals died the moment a person stepped behind a ridge. He had spent summers learning to read terrain by instinct, because his father insisted that a malfunctioning satellite should never determine whether a man lived or died in the wilderness. For Elias, the Academy's system shutdown felt less like a danger and more like a familiar challenge. As the panic escalated around him, he stepped onto a flat stone, looking across the group. He wanted to understand how disoriented everyone had become. The cadets kept spinning in circles, searching for non-existent signals, calling out to the instructors even though the instructors had already vanished over the ridge. A faint tremor ran across the ground, just a shift in temperature and wind, but to the aliens, who no longer had sensors to interpret the data, it felt like the world itself was destabilizing. Someone shouted that a storm might be forming. Someone else claimed the valley floor was vibrating. A third cadet insisted a predator was moving nearby. Elias knew all three statements were exaggerated, but he said nothing yet. He understood that speaking now would draw attention before he had a complete picture of the group's mental state. He walked away from the panicking crowd and moved toward a natural ledge overlooking the basin. Without implants, he needed a higher vantage point to gather the kind of information he usually processed instinctively. He analyzed the valley, sun position, wind direction, the natural curvature of the canyon walls. The fog drifted in slow sheets, but not thick enough to obscure outlines. The ridges cast sharp triangular shadows, which meant the terrain would shift in difficulty as light faded. He studied rock colorations to estimate moisture pockets and traced faint animal tracks that cut through loose soil. Every detail built a mental map. Meanwhile, from behind him came a rising chorus of despair. A cadet cried out that she could not feel her neural thermometer anymore and might freeze without it. Another declared that he would not be able to sleep without infravision to detect nocturnal predators. Elias turned and walked toward them, slow enough not to startle anyone. He spoke calmly, reminding the group that temperatures in this valley did not drop low enough to kill during this season, and that nocturnal predators avoided areas filled with large groups. Some cadets stared at him as if he had spoken in an ancient dialect. Without sensors, the aliens seemed incapable of trusting their own senses. For them, the world had become unpredictable because their tools could no longer interpret it. Elias understood the instructor's intentions immediately. The test was not about survival in the valley. It was about survival without dependence on technology. The Academy wanted the cadets to remember that tools were extensions, not replacements, of skill. And right now, the aliens had forgotten that. The sun dipped lower, and the fog thickened. The cadets began clustering together for comfort, forming an uncoordinated mass with no direction. Someone asked where the team should camp. Someone else asked where water was. Another asked how to measure daylight without a chronometer. Elias exhaled slowly. The valley was becoming more dangerous not because of predators or storms, but because of disorganized fear. So he stepped forward and spoke firmly, projecting his voice just enough to cut through the rising confusion. He explained that darkness was still hours away, that the ridge lines revealed natural water flow, and that the group needed to move to higher ground before fog concealed the lower paths. Several cadets objected, claiming they could not navigate without a digital map. Elias crouched, picked up a stick, and drew a rough outline of the valley floor in the dirt. He marked the main ridges, the slope lines, and the water channel. The aliens watched the growing sketch with disbelief. None of them understood how he reconstructed the area so easily when he had seen it only once from the drop-off point earlier that morning. He finished the drawing, stood, and looked across the group. The panic softened. Not disappeared, just softened, as if the hand-drawn map gave the cadets the first anchor they had since the shutdown. The test had officially begun, and the human was the only one not drowning in fear. He knew this valley would not defeat him. The Academy wanted leadership born of clarity, and Elias intended to give it. The instructors had turned off every piece of technology, but they had also unintentionally turned Elias into the only person in the valley who understood how to function without it. Elias remained beside the dirt map long enough to see the first hints of understanding flicker across a few faces. The cadets still looked overwhelmed, but the raw panic had begun to settle. Fear was no longer blinding them. It was merely clouding their judgment. He knew he could work with that. The next step was giving them tools that did not depend on circuitry or implants, but still offered structure and predictability. The sun had risen high enough to cast long beams across the valley, creating sharp lines that highlighted ridges and slopes. Elias used those shadows as guides, stepping away from the cluster of cadets to gather materials. He searched for anything that could leave marks, measure distance, or carry meaning. He moved with a quiet confidence that unsettled some of the aliens. A few followed him with their eyes, unsure whether to ask questions or remain still. He did not speak yet, because he wanted them to see how much the terrain already offered if one simply paid attention. He stopped near a charred log at the base of a slope. The wood had been scorched by a lightning strike days earlier, leaving a hardened black crust rich with charcoal. Elias broke off a piece and rubbed it between his fingers until it left dark stains on his skin. The cadet stared at the primitive material as if it were a relic from a forgotten age. He carried it back to the map and used it to trace cleaner, more visible lines. Thin pathways marking animal trails, gentle arcs showing elevation, dots marking likely water flow. The map grew more detailed with each stroke. Some cadets began leaning closer, mesmerized by how easily information appeared without a single glowing icon or digital readout. Elias knew the charcoal was only the beginning. The group needed more than a diagram. It needed a way to navigate the land without relying on memory alone. He found several long, straight twigs from a nearby shrub and laid them across the map to represent compass lines, even though no one had a compass anymore. He angled them according to the sun's path and explained that the light itself would serve as a reference if they learned to read the sky instead of searching for digital markers. A cadet with silver scale skin stepped forward nervously and asked how he could determine direction if the fog thickened. Elias showed him how wind patterns created subtle ripples in the sand and how the moisture on the rocks changed depending on which side faced the sun. The cadet touched the stone and widened his eyes at the temperature difference. Elias nodded, pleased the cadet grasped it quickly. The others watched, drawn in by the growing realization that the environment itself supplied answers they had previously sought from devices. More cadets approached him. A girl with translucent fins along her jaw asked how he remembered terrain after only one glance. Elias explained that he did not memorize every detail. Instead, he grouped features based on patterns. A ridge aligned with another, a shadow revealing a hidden slope, the sound of distant water echoing in a predictable rhythm. He taught her to tilt her head and listen. She closed her eyes and focused until she finally heard the faint gurgle of the water channel far below. She seemed shocked that her own ears could detect something her sensors used to report automatically. Elias walked slowly around the clearing, checking the soil, testing how his boots sank into different patches. He demonstrated how each texture indicated a varying level of moisture or stability. He pulled a vine from a low branch and braided it into a thin cord, stretching it between two stakes he carved with a broken stone shard. He used the cord to measure distances on the map, replicating the old surveying method his father had once shown him. The cadets whispered among themselves, astonished that these ancient techniques could replace advanced equipment. He stopped beside a wide boulder and tapped it lightly with his knuckles. The sound echoed differently on the left side, deeper on the right. He explained how hollow spaces beneath rocks produced lower tones and how resonance indicated stability or danger. A cadet with curved horns crouched beside the stone and tapped it as Elias instructed. His eyes widened as he recognized the difference immediately. Somewhere behind the group, a new sound cut through the valley, the groaning of shifting rock far up the slope. Without relying on scanners, several cadets panicked again, assuming a landslide was imminent. Elias remained calm and pointed toward the origin of the noise. He described how thermal expansion in the morning caused certain boulders to crack as sunlight heated them. He explained that this specific sound was not a sign of danger, but a predictable natural event. The cadets exchanged uncertain glances, gradually accepting that his confidence came from knowledge rather than luck. He continued gathering materials until he had enough charcoal, vines, sticks, stones, and bark to build what he considered a functional field kit. It looked primitive, but he knew it could organize the group far better than the inert devices strapped to their wrists. The cadets drifted closer, forming an uneven semicircle around him. They expected instructions, but he did not give orders yet. Instead, he set a simple example. He took a sheet of bark, scraped it smooth with a stone, and began sketching a smaller, portable version of the map. He held it close and used the charcoal to mark points of interest. Then he handed the bark to one of the cadets. The alien stared at it in disbelief, clutching it as though it were a priceless object. Elias made 3 more, assigning each to a different member of the group. He explained that maps must be redundant to avoid losing vital information if an accident occurred. The cadets nodded, impressed that the human anticipated risks before dangers even appeared. He walked a few steps toward a line of tall grass and demonstrated how to test wind direction by tossing dry blades into the air. He showed how dust patterns revealed upcoming weather. He even pointed out footprints of small creatures moving across the valley floor, teaching the cadets how to read the depth and spacing to determine the animal's speed and weight. Every explanation eased the tension in the group. Confusion faded. Fear retreated further. Curiosity replaced helplessness. One cadet finally asked how he could possibly know so many methods, especially when his species had access to advanced technology for centuries. Elias explained that his upbringing had emphasized independence from tools. His father had believed that a man who relied too heavily on devices would forget the instincts that kept his ancestors alive. The cadets listened quietly, struck by the idea that a human family deliberately chose hardship to preserve skill. Elias scanned the group, evaluating who had begun adapting and who still struggled. He saw potential forming, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. The cadets were not hopeless. They merely needed a framework built from something older than the Academy's sleek digital architecture. He knelt beside the map, added another layer of marks, and began outlining how the team would navigate the valley without technological support. For the first time since the shutdown, the group leaned in willingly, drawn not by fear, but by purpose. Elias knew the moment had shifted. The cadets were ready to learn. The humans' ancient toolkit was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming their lifeline. If you want, I can continue and write Chapter 3 in the same detailed 7,000, 8,000 character style. Elias knew the cadets would not last long with maps alone. Navigating the valley required coordination, and coordination meant communication. Without scanners or implants, the group had no method to send warnings or instructions across distance. Voices did not carry far in this terrain, and fog absorbed sound unpredictably. If the cadets split into scouting teams or moved to different elevations, the lack of signals would tear apart the fragile structure forming around his guidance. He needed a system that required no power, no technology, only consistency and discipline. The cadets stood near him, waiting for direction, their earlier panic replaced with a readiness born from the simple act of learning something useful. He understood that momentum was precious. Once he had their attention, he had to maintain it before doubt crept back in. He scanned the environment for natural materials that could serve as beacons or markers. His attention settled on a cluster of tall reeds near a shallow depression in the valley floor. The reeds were thin, flexible, and strong enough to withstand wind without snapping easily. He walked toward them, motioning for a few cadets to follow. The girl with translucent fins approached shyly, and the silver-scaled cadet joined her. Elias explained that the reeds would serve as flags once tied with bright fibers. The fibers would come from a flowering bush he had noticed earlier, whose petals left vivid stains when crushed. He handed the silver-scaled cadet a reed and instructed him to bend it slightly. The reed flexed and returned to shape without breaking, exactly as Elias expected. He located the bush quickly and rubbed a petal between his fingers until a bright smear of color appeared. The pigment was strong enough to remain visible even when dry. He pressed several petals into a cloth scrap he found near the drop-off point and twisted them to make a thicker streak of color. The cadets watched, fascinated that such a simple source could create a signal marker. Elias dipped the tip of the reed into the pigment, leaving a clear mark across it. He explained that the group would use these colored reeds as directional symbols. Planted upright in the soil, each colored band indicated a specific message: safe route, danger near, water ahead, or regroup point. He assigned colors carefully, choosing ones the cadets could easily distinguish with their natural vision, even in fog. The girl with the fins volunteered to test the visibility. She walked several steps away, then turned and scanned the reed. She nodded once, confirming the pigment caught light effectively. Elias created a small bundle of reeds and distributed them to the cadets, teaching each member how to plant one at an angle that maximized visibility. He emphasized consistency. Every reed must face the same direction relative to the valley's sun path. Without consistency, the signals would be useless. Next, he turned to the question of long-distance alerts. If something urgent happened, such as a predator approaching or a path collapsing, the group needed a way to warn one another instantly. Elias knelt near a patch of dry grass and tested its brittleness. It crackled under his fingers, ideal for creating smoke. He found a handful of damp moss nearby, and by squeezing it, he confirmed it held enough moisture to produce heavy smoke without igniting into flame. The cadets gathered around him as he arranged the materials and struck stones together to create sparks. He built a small fire, then smothered it strategically with the moss, generating a plume of dense, dark smoke. The plume rose slowly, curling upward before spreading into a thick vertical line. The cadets stared up at it, visibly impressed. Elias explained that one column of smoke meant regroup, 2 columns meant danger approaching, and 3 narrow columns meant immediate evacuation. He demonstrated how changing the bundle shape adjusted the plume's thickness. The girl with fins asked how the signals would function at night. Elias answered by gathering dry reeds and weaving them into torches. He coated them with sap from a nearby tree, forming a sticky layer that burned longer when ignited. He created 3 torches and lit one. Its steady flame cast long shadows across the rocks, and he explained that torch motions would replace smoke at night. A slow circle meant location marking, a high vertical hold meant safety, and a rapid horizontal wave meant urgent retreat. He extinguished the torch and moved on to close-range communication. If 2 scouting teams met unexpectedly, they needed a quiet way to identify one another. Noise attracted unwanted attention from the valley's creatures, some of which he had not yet seen, but knew existed based on the tracks he observed earlier. He snapped a thin branch, carving 2 small notches into it with a sharpened stone. When he struck the notches lightly, the branch produced a clear, sharp clicking sound. He created 2 more branches with different notch patterns. One produced a 2-click signal, another a 3-click series. Each sound was subtle, barely audible a few meters away, yet distinct enough for a trained ear. He handed the 3 branches to separate cadets, showed them the motions, and instructed them to stand apart and test recognition. The silver-scaled cadet clicked twice, and the cadet with horns answered with 3 clicks. The girl with fins approached silently, clicking once, signaling her presence without speaking. Elias nodded, satisfied. With enough practice, the group would move through the valley like an organized expedition, rather than a scattered cluster of frightened students. By afternoon, the cadets no longer clustered together in uncertainty. They spread out across the clearing with purpose, practicing the signals Elias assigned. He watched as the girl with fins planted reeds in a straight line to indicate a scouting route, while another cadet experimented with smoke plumes near a safe open space. The cadet with horns tested the torch techniques, learning to control the flames without letting sparks drift toward dry brush. Elias stepped back, observing their progress, and for the first time he saw genuine confidence forming in their posture. He decided to introduce one more layer of communication before evening arrived. Directional markers carved onto the environment itself. He selected flat tree bark, large stones, and even a fallen log. Using a sharp stone, he carved symbols representing safe zones, unstable ground, and clean water. He carved each symbol with clean strokes so that the cadets could reproduce them easily. He explained that carved markers were more durable than reeds and torches. They would survive wind, animals, and weather. He assigned 2 cadets to begin placing the carved symbols along likely routes out of the clearing. The pair hurried off with determination, grateful for a tangible task that allowed them to contribute. As shadows lengthened across the valley, he called the group together. The cadets formed a wide circle, waiting for the next instruction. Instead of lecturing, he asked each cadet to demonstrate one of the signaling techniques. One planted a reed correctly, Another lit a torch, waving it precisely. The third produced a 3-click pattern. Elias nodded after each demonstration, reinforcing that the group had begun to master the basics of low-tech coordination. He stood quietly as the cadets exchanged signals among themselves, creating a practice pattern without his direction. They adapted quickly, building confidence with each gesture and sound. Watching them, Elias felt an unexpected moment of satisfaction. The cadets were not just following his instructions, they were learning to rely on one another. The fog crept in slowly, wrapping the valley in muted gray, yet the cadets no longer flinched at its arrival. They now possessed the means to communicate across uncertainty. As the light dimmed and the camp prepared for nightfall, Elias felt the shift clearly. The group had moved beyond fear. With maps in hand and signals established, they now had the beginnings of a functioning system. A primitive one, yes, but in many ways more adaptable than the advanced one the Academy had taken away. The cadets were no longer helpless. They were capable, and that capability would shape everything that came next. By the time the first stars emerged above the valley, the clearing had transformed from a chaotic drop-off zone into something resembling an organized outpost. The cadets stood straighter, moved with more certainty, and looked to Elias not with desperation, but with anticipation. He understood that the transition into night would test the group's new skills more severely than anything so far. Darkness concealed hazards and distorted shapes. Even the bravest cadets grew anxious when the valley's temperature dipped and the sounds of nocturnal creatures echoed against the canyon walls. If the group faltered during these hours, the fragile coordination he had built could unravel. He needed to place every cadet into a structured role, not only to maintain order, but to anchor each member with responsibility. He stepped to the center of the clearing and called for attention. The cadets gathered around him in a wide circle, their torches flickering against the rising fog. He scanned their faces, choosing positions based on instinct and the small observations he had made earlier. The silver-scaled cadet had shown strong directional awareness, so Elias assigned him as a primary scout. The girl with translucent fins had exceptional hearing, making her ideal for monitoring sound patterns across the valley. The cadet with horns demonstrated focus and caution, traits that suited someone responsible for maintaining the perimeter. Elias gave him authority over night watch rotations. A few cadets shifted uncertainly, unsure whether they could handle assigned tasks. Elias walked among them, offering concise encouragement. He told one cadet that her steady hands made her suited for preparing tools. He told another that his calm breathing under pressure marked him as a dependable support runner. With each assignment, the cadet's posture transformed. Responsibility pulled them upright, anchoring them in purpose. He moved on to the practical structure of the camp itself. The clearing had no defined boundaries, making it vulnerable to intrusion from any direction. He selected 4 points around the perimeter and instructed the cadets to place torches along those lines. Each torch represented a corner of the camp's invisible walls. The group watched as he hammered stakes into the ground with stones and positioned torches at precise heights. When illuminated, the torches formed a protective square of warm light around the camp. The shape gave the cadets a psychological sense of containment, a boundary against uncertainty. Elias then began shaping the interior. He divided the clearing into sections. The center served as the command area, where maps and messages would be kept. A cluster of broad stones formed natural tables for tools, reeds, bark sheets, and charcoal. To reduce confusion, he instructed every cadet to return used materials to specific sides of the stones. Disorder, he explained, could destroy coordination faster than any external threat. The cadets nodded solemnly, understanding that the efficiency of the camp depended on discipline. He moved next to the sleeping areas. He chose a patch of ground slightly elevated from the rest of the clearing, safe from potential water runoff. He demonstrated how to arrange sleeping spots in a staggered pattern, ensuring each cadet could see at least one torch from where he or she rested. The cadet with horns asked why visibility mattered if perimeter guards would remain awake. Elias explained that fear often attacked the mind when sight failed. A visible flame offered reassurance, allowing the guards to focus without being distracted by anxious whispers. With the perimeter set and sleeping areas marked, Elias turned his attention to supplies. The cadets had scattered belongings and limited provisions spread haphazardly across the ground. He instructed them to gather everything useful: cloth, containers, scraps of rope, even broken equipment. He showed them how to repurpose damaged gear. A cracked visor became a reflective signal tool. A snapped strap became material for binding reed bundles. A dented metal plate became a small digging tool. The cadets watched with awe as each useless item transformed into something functional. Once the supplies were organized, he built a communal workstation. He gathered long branches and laid them horizontally between two boulders to form a makeshift platform. It created a stable surface for grinding pigments, shaping reeds, carving symbols, and marking new map updates. He assigned 2 cadets to maintain the workstation throughout the night, replacing worn-out tools and preparing fresh materials for morning tasks. The assignment energized those cadets, giving them a purpose beyond simple survival. The fog thickened gradually, softening the edges of torchlight. Elias sensed a shift in the valley's atmosphere. The nocturnal cycle had begun. Distant rustling drifted across the canyon, and several cadets tensed instinctively. The girl with fins turned her head sharply, picking up faint movement through sound alone. Elias stepped beside her and listened. The sound was rhythmic, light, and scattered. He explained calmly that the noise came from a small grazing animal rather than a predator. Her shoulders eased, and she stood taller with the realization that she could interpret her surroundings without sensors. To reinforce night operations, Elias demonstrated how to move silently across uneven terrain. He stepped lightly, rolling his feet from outer edge to inner arch, distributing weight slowly. He taught the scouts to mimic the motion. The silver-scaled cadet practiced until his feet barely disturbed the dust. Elias then instructed him to circle the clearing and report on torch visibility. The cadet moved into the fog, and moments later his silhouette reappeared with a confident nod. All corners were visible. The perimeter system worked. Next, Elias focused on communication during night hours. With smoke signals rendered useless, torches and carved symbols took precedence. He created a second set of torches with varied burn patterns. One burned bright but short, another burned long but dim. He assigned meanings to each and drilled the cadets on recognition. The cadet with horns practiced holding a torch in steady positions, learning how to send messages without trembling. Another cadet practiced weaving through the clearing without allowing the flame to flicker dangerously. Each small success strengthened the camp's cohesion. As tasks continued, Elias began structuring the watch rotations. He gathered the cadets and explained that no one could remain fully alert through the entire night. He divided the hours into shifts, assigning pairs to each. The girl with fins partnered with the silver-scaled cadet. The cadet with horns paired with a quiet, observant boy who had shown steady nerves earlier. He instructed each pair to check the torches, monitor sound and movement, and update the carved markers if terrain changed. He warned them that wind could shift the fog unpredictably, making observation more challenging. Each pair accepted the responsibility without hesitation. He finalized the organization by creating a central ledger, a bark sheet marked with symbols representing every camp duty. He added small notches beside names to track completed tasks. The ledger gave the cadets a visible representation of their contributions. When he handed it to the cadet with horns, the young man accepted it with solemn pride. Responsibility no longer frightened him. It defined him. Night settled fully over the valley, but the camp did not succumb to fear. The torches glowed steadily, outlining a square of safety. Scouts moved along the perimeter with deliberate silence. The workstation flickered with light as 2 cadets carved symbols into bark. The girl with fins lifted her head occasionally, listening for distant changes. Elias stood near the central map area, adding fresh details the scouts had gathered before sunset. He looked around the camp and saw order where chaos once stood. The cadets were no longer reacting to the valley's uncertainty. They were acting within it, shaping their environment with discipline and awareness. The camp resembled the early expeditions he had read about in history lessons, teams navigating hostile terrain with nothing but cooperation, observation, and ingenuity. Elias felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. The academy had stripped the cadets of every advanced tool, but in return, it had given him the opportunity to build something far stronger than reliance on machinery. He stepped back from the central stone and watched the cadets fulfill their roles with growing confidence. For the first time since the test began, the valley did not feel hostile. It felt conquered, not through force, but through structure. The human had turned a frightened cluster of students into a coordinated expedition. And the night, once a threat, had become merely another element to master. Morning arrived quietly, without the dramatic shifts that usually accompanied sunrise in the valley. The fog thinned in gentle waves, revealing the clearing in a soft golden haze. Torches still burned at the edges, their flames lowered to embers by the night watch. Cadets moved through the camp with a confidence that had not existed the previous day. Elias watched the transformation with calm satisfaction. The structure he had built had taken root so deeply that the cadets no longer looked to him for every decision. They moved with purpose, maintaining the systems he had introduced as though they had operated this way for months instead of hours. He stepped toward the central map area and inspected the updates completed during the night shift. The scouts had added fresh markings describing wind changes and terrain shifts. The fact that the cadets had done this on their own impressed him more than anything else. Their dependence on technology had faded, replaced by awareness and discipline. He adjusted a few symbols, corrected a slope angle, and rechecked the reed color placements to ensure accuracy. The cadet with horns approached him, carrying the ledger with new notches carved into it. His expression held no fear, only the steady assurance of someone who had discovered his own capability. Elias nodded and handed the ledger back, trusting him to manage the next rotation. The cadet accepted it with pride and returned to his duties. The human felt no need to hover or instruct. Leadership worked best when those being guided eventually guided themselves, and the camp was well on its way to functioning independently of him. He took a moment to walk the perimeter. The torches were evenly spaced, the ground showed carefully placed footprints rather than chaotic trampling, and carved symbols marked safe paths leading outward from the clearing. The valley's atmosphere no longer pressed against the cadets like a threat. It had become something they understood, something they had learned to read, shape, and navigate. Elias paused at the far edge, listening to faint morning sounds. A distant rustle indicated a harmless grazing creature. A slow creaking came from cooling stones on the ridge. Nothing signaled danger. Just as he turned back toward the camp, a sharp cry echoed from the western slope. A scout rushed down the incline, waving a reed marker coded for urgent attention. Elias moved swiftly toward him as several cadets gathered, ready for instruction, but not panicked. The scout explained breathlessly that the instructors had triggered an artificial disturbance, rockfalls, shifting fog pockets, and misleading echoes designed to test reaction and coordination. The cadet with fins listened closely and confirmed the sounds came from multiple directions. The cadet with horns immediately signaled the perimeter guards to heighten vigilance. Elias knelt and studied the map, considering how the valley's terrain could be manipulated artificially. He realized the instructors were escalating the test, pushing the cadets to see whether the systems they had built could withstand pressure. He marked several predicted points of impact and instructed scouts to verify them using the silent movement technique he had taught the previous night. The scouts left immediately, moving through the fog without hesitation. Within minutes, the first reports returned. One scout confirmed a triggered rock slide that posed no real threat but could easily frighten inexperienced cadets. Another reported swirling fog that masked a small slope. A third described an artificial predator call echoing from the canyon wall. Elias studied each report and updated the map accordingly. The cadets gathered around him, watching his hands move with practiced precision. But this time, instead of waiting silently for direction, they offered their own observations, contributing corrections and reinforcing details. The camp was no longer a group dependent on one leader. It was a functioning team. Elias issued assignments. The cadet with fins took charge of monitoring sound patterns. The silver-scaled cadet led a group to verify terrain stability near the slide. The cadet with horns supervised defensive torch placements and ensured that the perimeter remained intact. Elias remained at the center, coordinating updates on the map and adjusting read markers to guide returning teams. The clearing pulsed with controlled activity, every member moving with clear purpose. When the instructors released a sudden barrage of deep rumbling noises meant to mimic large predators, not a single cadet panicked. The girl with fins identified the echo distortions and signaled that no creature was actually approaching. The cadet with horns reinforced the perimeter with bright torches. The scouts moved through the fog, updating symbols as they confirmed each manipulated hazard. Through it all, Elias remained steady, guiding transitions with quiet authority rather than force. His leadership had shifted into something more subtle. The cadets no longer needed to be held together through reassurance. They held themselves together through competence. As the disturbances continued, the camp adapted so quickly that the instructor's test began to lose its intended effect. Every artificial threat was identified, analyzed, and neutralized through the systems Elias had established. The cadet's coordination impressed even him. He watched as the silver-scaled scout returned, describing a deceptive fog pocket. Before Elias could respond, another cadet already prepared a read marker to redirect anyone approaching the slope. Efficiency rippled through the group like a steady current. Then, abruptly, the artificial disturbances ceased. The valley fell into deep silence, windless and still. A moment later, the ridge above them brightened with a sudden flare of light. The instructors stepped forward, lined along the cliff in a formation that signaled the test's conclusion. Their voices, amplified through old-fashioned speakers instead of implants, rolled across the valley with an unmistakable mixture of astonishment and respect. The lead instructor announced that the cadets had not merely passed the test. They had surpassed expectations so dramatically that the Academy would need to revise its evaluation standards. He explained that the purpose of shutting down all technology had been to expose weaknesses in instinct, discipline, and adaptability. Instead, under Elias's guidance, the team demonstrated exceptional coordination, creativity, and problem-solving skills worthy of advanced expedition units. The instructor's voice carried a tone of reluctant admiration as he admitted that the cadets had performed better without technology than most groups did with full equipment. As the announcement ended, the cadets turned toward Elias. Their expressions held gratitude, pride, and something deeper, recognition. They understood that he had not simply taught them survival techniques. He had shown them how to trust their own senses, how to observe, how to think, how to adapt without fear. Several approached him, not to celebrate, but to thank him quietly and sincerely. The cadet with horns saluted him with the torch held upright. The girl with fins placed her hand over her heart. The silver-scaled cadet bowed his head in acknowledgement. Elias accepted their gestures without dramatics. He felt satisfaction, but also something else, relief. The purpose of survival training was not to prove superiority, but to awaken capability. If he had done anything meaningful, it was helping the cadets discover strengths they had never imagined they possessed. As the fog lifted fully and sunlight poured into the clearing, the cadets dismantled the camp with the same discipline they had shown while building it. Reeds were gathered, torches extinguished, symbols recorded for later study. Even in closing the camp, the efficiency remained. When the last marker was removed and the clearing stood silent once more, Elias looked around and felt a strange sense of completion. The instructors descended into the valley, offering nods of approval. One instructor approached Elias directly, acknowledging that the human had done something extraordinary. He had revived methods forgotten by most modern species and proven that skill, not technology, defined true survival. The instructor concluded with a simple but profound statement. The Academy would remember this test for years to come. As the cadets prepared to leave the valley, Elias walked last, glancing back at the empty clearing. The valley no longer appeared hostile. It looked peaceful, almost welcoming. He realized that the transformation he witnessed in the cadets mirrored a transformation in himself. He had entered the test expecting to demonstrate competence. He left it having built a team capable of facing uncertainty with unity and purpose. The conclusion was clear and complete. The valley had tested them. He had guided them. And together, they had turned a powerless situation into a triumph of discipline, awareness, and human resilience. The lesson would remain with every cadet long after the valley faded from memory. The test had ended,